the Mughal Empire in the 17th century. Let's begin the program with prayer by Mr. Sadasiva.
Shiba ma'am?
Yes, sir. Sir, I'm there. I'll lead the prayer.
Please, could be opening prayer, ma'am.
Yeah, sure, sir. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Ma'am,
Yes,
you're
ma'am.
audible.
Okay. Let's pray. Oh God, who in the days past did put into the hearts of good men to found this college for the imparting of sound learning, the building of character, and the spread of spiritual truth and knowledge of thyself. Bless our college and schools. May love, unity, and brotherhood be learned here. May industry, uprightness, and courage grow here. And from this place, may there be sent forth continually a stream of men and women who shall serve thee faithfully in thy word. Amen.
I invite our head of the department, Dr. R. Venkat Ramanujam, to deliver welcome address.
A very good afternoon to all of you. It gives me immense pleasure to invite each and every one for the third lecture in the International by the Department of History, Madras Christian College. First and foremost, I take pleasure in inviting our speaker for the day, Dr. Srinivas Reddy, visiting Professor of Religious Studies and Contemplative Studies at the Brown University, and also guest professor of South and Southeast Asian Studies at IIT Gandhinagar. Today he is going to deliver us a lecture on the topic Lost at Sea, the Mughal Empire in the 17th century. Sir, welcome, sir, to us, and we hope that when you come to India to host you in our college premises also. I also welcome the heads of the departments, faculty from our college, faculty and guests from other colleges, and dear students to this webinar. The topic of this webinar is very interesting. I handle history of Europe and discuss with the students about the developments in seafaring, which had led to the discovery of new sea routes, new land, and so on, which changed the history of the world completely. It is interesting that at around the same period, this lecture is going to look at the condition of seafaring in the Mughal Empire in India. I'm sure it will throw us a lot of light to the answers that we have been seeking as to why the European companies succeeded after the decline of the Mughal Empire. With these words, I once again welcome one and all to this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I call upon Dr. K. Ashok to introduce the speaker of the program.
Good afternoon to one and all who are connected through virtually for this talk. I'm very glad to introduce the speaker for this month, Dr. Srinivas Reddy. Dr. Srinivas Reddy is a visiting assistant professor of Religious Studies and Contemplative Studies, Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island, US. He was awarded PhD from South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley in June 2011. For his thesis entitled The Amakuta Malayada of Krishnadeva Raya, Language, Power and Devotion in 16th century South India. My association with Srini started with one of his articles. I was just looking for an article on Mughal Navy. By accidentally, I came across an article which was penned by Srini, titled Disrupting Mughal Imperialism, Piracy and Plunder on the Indian Ocean. Then I contacted Srini, and Srini was very gracious. Immediately he accepted my invitation and he said he will make his time available for us. Talking about Dr. Srini, Srini is a multifaceted personality. He is a musician, he's a polyglot, author, and a teacher. As a musician, he is a trained player of sitar, and he is a disciple of Pandit Partha Chatterjee of the Sena Mahar Grahana lineage of Ustad Ali Akbar Khan, Pandit Nikhil Banerjee. He has released many recordings. He's a polyglot, as we all know, a person who can speak many languages. He is very fluent. He is native of Telugu. He is very fluent in Telugu, in an intermediate knowledge of Hindi, and beginning Tibetan advanced language training. And Srini is good in reading and translating texts from Sanskrit, Pali, Telugu, and Tamil. And Srini is also an author of good number of books. And his recent work, Raya, Krishnadeva Raya of Vijayanagara, which was published by the Diachronic books in 2020, is one of his popular books. He has also written some of his other titles are The Cloud Message, Kalidasa's Meghatudam, which was published by Penguin in 2017, The Dancer and the King, Kalidasa's Malavika Agnimitram, again by Penguin in 2014, Giver of the Own Garland, Sri Krishna Deva Raya's Amukuta Malayada by Penguin Books in 2010. And Srini also shares his time between India and US. He is also the visiting assistant professor of South Asian Studies, Humanities Department, IIT Gandhinagar, where he teaches classical Indian literature and music traditions of India. He has occupied various positions as visiting lecturer, Indic Studies, University of Massachusetts, visiting professor, anthropology, ISCTE, Lisbon, Portugal. So I was just going through web to get some connections about Srini, and I found there was one interesting thing about Srini's remark on historical sources. So talking about sources, he made a reference like this: sensitively reading each source with respect to its context, its production, its author, and its intended audience. So Srini was talking, how do sources interact with each other? How do they reinforce, contradict, and complicate our understanding of history? So with a brief note, I once again warmly welcome Dr. Srinivas Reddy and all others who have connected through online for this international webinar series. Srini, I request Dr. Srinivas Reddy to present his talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashok, Dr. Venkataramanujan, and all of you at the Madras Christian College for inviting me and welcoming me. It's an honor and pleasure to be with you all. And I do hope I can visit sometime and be with you all physically. And one day, hopefully that will happen. That was a very big introduction to a very small person that I am. As Ashokji mentioned, like I have lots of interests, and in my disciplinary training, I was more of a language and literature person, reading old texts and whatnot. And although I wasn't trained in the discipline of history, I took a lot of history classes. I took a great interest in history, and so what I'll present today is a bit of the kind of work I did in more on the historical side of things. And as Ashokji mentioned, I had written a paper about this, and really the talk today is a review of that. So Ashokji will know everything that I'm going to say, although there are a few points that I was also meditating on as I was rereading the paper that I'll address, and then hopefully we can have a good discussion about some of those ideas. So let me think. The other thing, a lot of this particular research came out of a good amount of work that I did relating to the Indian Ocean, and even the work on Vijayanagara and all of that Deccan world was also connected to the Indian Ocean trade vis-a-vis the Portuguese. So the Indian Ocean in some way seems to be this connecting factor for a lot of my research. And that also gives, I think, some indication about historical change in relation to different cultures and their relationship to oceans and seas. So just to start, like, I mean, generally, when people have characterized India as, you know, historically a place that never had any seafaring, that never was interested in kind of leaving the shores, this kala pani, you know, this never leave, this is you know, the dark, scary land outside, water outside that you know, you shouldn't cross, that kind of thing. We never had like a continuous, I would say, history of seafaring. But when you look back, I mean, even the most early strata that we have, you have the, you know, the Indus Valley civilization in Lothal, a place that I was near in Gujarat. They've definitely confirmed that this was a port type city with docks and ships and a massive amount of trade that was going on between Gujarat and you know, like Mesopotamia, and moving across that part of the Indian Ocean into the Arabian Sea. And interestingly, it's that zone, which actually I'll talk a little bit about today. So what I'm trying to say is that although it is true that I would not characterize India as like a great naval power, um, I wouldn't at the same time discredit some of the important seafaring activities that Indians participated in throughout history. So what we'll look at right now is the Mughal Empire, specifically the European colonial powers that they were interacting with, the internal empires, or, you know, groups that they were interacting with, particularly the Marathas, and how the relationship with sea, port cities, trading, and also particularly in regard to the Mughal naval powers, is the importance of the pilgrimage, Hajj pilgrimage, going there and having that regularity of traffic. So all of that I'll mention. And okay, so let me start now with the next slide so everyone can see this. So this is a picture or image of Mariam Zamani, who you might know by another name. Her Rajput name was Jodhabai. So this is actually Akbar's wife, Jahangir's mother. And why I also wanted to start with her is, you know, again, a lot of, you know, historical research that we do is interrogating and sometimes overturning or complicating or complexifying, you know, old notions that we have, like this particular notion about Indians in the sea, or in this case, you know, women and enterprise, women and power, particularly in the Mughal court. I mean, Nur Jahan is a good example of a very powerful woman, but there were many women in the Mughal, you know, world, particularly the elite Mughal world, that had a lot of power and were deeply connected to trade. And because of that trade, they would also have to have some connection to ports and to ships. So what I'm going to do in this paper is explore 5 different events that happened along this 100-year kind of period in the 17th century, and trace some of the, you know, ebbs and flows, to use a maritime phrase, of power. Sorry, Dr. is requesting to annotate the shared content. Should I say yes to that?
Yeah, yeah, tell me.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Can you all still see the... Okay, I don't know what happened now. Can you see the what?
There's a plain screen.
Yeah,
We can see pointer.
I don't know. Dr. Jaya something.
Jay Prathapan.
Prathapan. I don't know what happened with that, but let's see.
Just 1 minute, Steve. 1 minute. Give me that.
Okay. Maybe I can just stop sharing and start again. Okay. Is it there?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So what I was saying was we'll look at 5 events in this 100-year period, and that will allow us to track some very interesting ups and downs that happen, and very interesting changes of allegiance. And I think that's another big historical point that I like to think about, even in my Vijayanagara research, is that sometimes we characterize, well, particularly in Vijayanagara, everything's on religious lines. It was, Vijayanagara was this Hindu empire against the, onslaught of Islam. But, all of that is really overplayed. And when you really look at the history, you see that there's all sorts of connections and, allegiances and loyalties that people are making, because life is more complicated in a simple analysis based on just religious affiliation. There's a lot of other things going on. And so we find that here in the 17th century as well. So fundamentally, what I'm saying is that this is a diachronic, what we would call a diachronic historical analysis. So it's looking across time to find out some trends rather than looking, maybe at one specific moment in time. So in that way, we'll try to map things out. So the first event relates to Jodhabai because she was the owner of a very famous ship called the Rahimi that was basically taken over by Portuguese pirates. And at this point in kind of the maritime power dynamics of things, the Portuguese pretty much controlled not all, but a majority of major port cities all along the Arabian coast, and then into India, and then of course they made Goa their main stopping place. But they continued along the coast, to Sri Lanka, and they went all the way up. So the Portuguese had quite an interesting maritime colonial policy, which, by the way, as we'll see, is quite distinct from, let's say, the British, because the Portuguese, they never really kind of had an agenda of creating a land empire. So they just stayed on the coasts, and they used the coasts and these ports to really, develop trade and make money in that way. And they didn't really, proceed inland to create what we would call like a massive colony the way that the British did. So this is an interesting differential between the two. So the Portuguese in the 16th century, early 16th century, are masters of the Indian Ocean, at least that Western Indian Ocean, and they had a policy of creating this thing called a cartaz. So the cartaz was like, it's like a kagas, where are your papers kind of thing. So that and to get that cartaz, they would basically, exorbitantly price it. And since the Mughals, what they did have on their side was a lot of wealth. And so for them, they acquiesced, I would say, to this high price because they didn't really have any other option, and because money wasn't such a big issue for them, it was okay. And so they continued on in this way, kind of allowing Portuguese control of the sea to, further, even as Mughal power might have been rising. So the other theme that I talk about in this paper is piracy. And piracy, again, is another one. When we think of pirates, you think, these very, unruly fellows and, a motley crew of people. And, without good manners or something, running around doing all this stuff. But piracy, as again, I'll explain a little bit later, really developed out of colonial needs. And I'll talk more about that later. But anyway, the point that I'm making here is that the Portuguese controlled all of this stuff, but there were also Portuguese who kind of wanted to subvert even that Portuguese control and just make money on their own. And the best way to do that was just to take over these ships. So that's the first event that we'll talk about. 1613, the Rahimi is captured by Portuguese pirates. Okay, then the next two events are battles that happen inland. One was the Battle of Surat. That was in 1664. Shivaji leads an attack because he needed, number one, money. Surat was incredibly wealthy, all, of course, due to the trade. So he needed money, and he really wanted to strike a blow to, you know, the kind of crown jewel of Mughal port cities. So that's the second one. The next third one is in 1676. That's the battle for Janjira, a fort that was controlled, like a sea fort that was controlled by the Siddhis, and I'll get into who they are. And then the last two, which I'll come to at the end, were again very famous pirate raids, now this time by the British, again on two, well, one Mughal ship and one Gujarati ship that was also had Mughal connections. So I'll come to all of those in order. The main thing I just wanted to stress here was that women in Mughal times had a lot of power that we don't hear about. And one of the ways that they developed that power was through trade. They had, you know, this Jodhabai had like quite a big, let us say, treasury at her disposal. And so she would, you know, spend that money on developing this trade with these ships. And so let me see. She had the authority to issue farmans, and she retained a sizable personal treasury, engaged in considerable business activities, both on land and at sea, with all different kinds of merchants, including Portuguese, British, and Dutch traders. So this was the first time that there was like a really big attack on, and here, this is not just any Mughal ship. This is the, you know, the Mughal Emperor's mother's ship that was attacked. So this was quite a big deal. Now, all of these Mughal trading ships had a dual function. At one level, they were trading vessels with goods being transported. But in addition to that, Surat particularly, and a lot of these trading ships would also be vessels to carry these Haji pilgrims to Mecca. And so there was this kind of interesting connection between, you know, religious pilgrimage and trade that the Mughals basically kind of linked together in their, you know, most of their dealings. So I'll just read this quote about the kind of feeling that people had when the Portuguese would try to, you know, do these kinds of what the Mughals obviously felt were very problematic and disruptive attacks. So at one point, and you also have to remember that the Portuguese, you know, are just coming out of their own kind of Inquisition type scenario where they were pushing, you know, the Moors out of Iberia. And so there was a lot of Islamic xenophobia inside the Portuguese to begin with. So all of these things kind of like came together and created this animosity between them. There was a point where these attacks were getting so troublesome to people that somebody wanted to issue, this was actually at Akbar's court, a fatwa that, like a ruling, that Hajj was no longer necessary. So because people were getting, you know, injured on these trips, so it got to the point where it was really affecting kind of, you know, Mughal social, religious, you know, practice. So it really was getting to, you know, a state where I think the Mughals really should have acted more decisively, more to develop this kind a navy or some kind of way to attack this, but they never really put a lot of energy into doing that. And basically, the underlying theme of my, of this paper was fundamentally that this was maybe not the reason. I know historians like to say, this was the reason this happened, but there's always a multiple factors, in terms of reasoning. But one of the reasons I believe that Mughal supremacy died out is because of this lack of a navy. And inversely, the rise of European colonial powers was really due to the power of their navy, particularly, like the British, who had such a wonderful, control over the sea and a very powerful navy. So this is the first incident that really caused a big uproar, and this was coming from European powers. And here's a beautiful picture of Jahangir. So here now we come to Surat, which was always historically a very, very important port. All of that side of Gujarat, Cambay, they used to call it, or Bharuch, they also called it in the older text. That whole side was incredibly important in terms of particularly the traffic that was moving west to, the Arabian Peninsula. So Surat was already by this point incredibly wealthy. And after Akbar's annexation of Gujarat, it really became like the key and most important port for all of this Hajj pilgrimage and whatever mercantile kind of trading ships were engaged by the Mughals was pretty much flowing through Surat. That was their main kind of gateway to the sea. So, as I was mentioning before, it was quite, wealthy. There was a lot of money there. It wasn't necessarily like a terribly well defended place. It wasn't like they had a big army sitting there. So this became the perfect target for Shivaji to gain money and to disrupt this Mughal trading. So, and it was a really here's another example of what I mean by things don't work just on religious lines. I mean, the Maratha troops go into Surat and they just, looted the place, burned the place. And a lot of people that they hurt were not just Mughals or Muslims. There was Jain, Hindu, all sorts of people that were affected by this. So, we need to take time to complicate some of these very linear distinctions that I think that we make when we discuss particularly religious identity in the past and how that might have affected, historical events. So a related attack or battle was in a close by town, and I think I have a picture of this place. Yeah, Suali. This is also a lot of this was a little bit earlier, but I'll read you a quote because this is a place where the British were attacking the Portuguese, and they're trying to find supremacy in terms of their own power at sea, like who is really going to control all of this stuff. And this was the beginning of, the rise of British power and the decline of Portuguese maritime power. So this battle, this was early on. This is around that Rahimi time in 1612, but it was close by to Surat. And one historian says this battle has as good a right as any other to be called one of the most decisive battles of the world. And I don't know if I would agree with that 100%, but it certainly was important in terms of the significance of what it represented. And to me, it really represents, again, that ascendancy of British power and the decline of the Portuguese. Okay. Another interesting little tidbit. This battle was what prompted the British East India Company to establish a small, fleet of the Royal Navy in order to guard, all these commercial interests that the British had. And which is, and this is ironic. And then again, another thing that we need to think about, this is where even today that the Indian Navy believes the Indian Navy began, which is funny because, towards the end of this period, like into the early 18th century, that's when we actually do get a Maratha kind of navy starting. And it's interesting how, we remain so colonized sometimes still in India in the way that we, envision our own history. But that's all a process, and we have to think about it. And I know we are. But it would be great if we had more research on things like, this Angre, who is the famous Maratha Navy captain. So I'll come to him in a second. Okay, let's keep going because I know there's not much time. So here's Malik Umber, very famous. He comes from the Siddhi community. They came from Africa. Usually they came as, I don't want to say slaves, that's not exactly the right word, but some kind of, servants and workers. And, an amazing history. I mean, moving up the ranks, and actually Malik Umber was, he was like basically the de facto ruler of Ahmednagar. And, very powerful and incredibly hated by Jahangir. And I think yeah. So this is a very famous picture of Jahangir shooting the beheaded head of Malik Umber, which of course never really happened, and he didn't kill him. But what's interesting about the Siddhis is as they grow in power, and at one point, again, I'm showing these shifting alliances. At one level, Jahangir wants to kill them, and then later on, we find that what happens? The Mughals themselves contract out the Siddhis to be basically their naval kind of wing. So this is within a half century, the Siddhis went from a hated nuisance to the Mughals to a trusted ally. So they had one particular fort. I think that's the next. Yeah. So Janjira Fort is like a really amazing fort. And these forts are different than other forts because these are what we call sea forts. These are forts that are basically positioned right on the water with guns facing the water, waiting to attack any kind of enemy ships that are approaching. So really even though it's something on land, it's very much directed towards the sea. And I still think of them as kind of like sea, conscious, places and events. So this fort it's considered impregnable. Like actually it's never been taken. The Marathas, once the Mughals had contracted the Siddhis to be their naval power, the Marathas were, kind of destabilized by that. And so there were a number of attacks on Janjira Fort by the Marathas, but none of them worked. There was even one rumor that they tried to, bury dig a tunnel underneath so they could get into the fort, but nothing worked. This place was impregnable, and basically remained important to the development of the Siddhi power. And they, in fact, at one point, the Mughals even made them kind of like the de facto leaders of the Mughal Navy, and they gave them, all these titles and whatnot. And so it was because of their, power and their connection to the sea that they were brought into the Mughal, empire or the Mughal fold. And it caused a lot of issues for the Marathas who were trying to fight against the Mughals. And so the Marathas, because they couldn't take this one, they actually invested heavily, and they had a kind of foresight on how important this kind of naval power was going to be in creating other forts like this Padma-Durg. So you can see how amazing these places are, like out with the rocks and the sea, and they were critical for making sure that there wasn't any kind of secret attack by sea. Okay, so that's those are a few of the events. Now let's go back to some of the pirates and what happens later. And really, this is where the British take their ascendancy, is in the later 17th century. So let's see. So one of the things, well, first I should mention about pirates and this whole idea of, like I was saying, this motley crew of people. Interestingly enough, many of the pirates, that some of the most famous ones, and I'll mention them in a second, were what they called privateers. And these privateers, they were really just people contracted by the colonial powers. So, for example, the British would send out some of their Navy men as privateers to go and attack French or Spanish ships to steal their goods, and then bring it back to England, and then distribute it. And so, in a way, these colonial powers are actually funding what we might think of as a type of pirate activity. But they called it privateering, and it was sanctioned by the state. Now, what would happen was some of these privateers would get frustrated by all this, of having to give all this money back to the crown, and so they basically took the stuff for themselves and lived in small places. Nassau, for example, is a very famous hangout for these pirates. They even tried to create their own kind of pirate society, pirate island. But by doing so, then they picked up this kind of image of being, these, violent and unethical type of people on the sea. And what's interesting about the pirates, and really what was happening at the world, is a lot of these pirates were out in the Atlantic. But little by little, they started coming more to this side of things because there was just so much opportunity. The fact, for example, like this pirate round, they would go up from the coast of the east coast of Africa into the Red Sea, Arabian Sea area here, and then move into Western India. And that was called the pirate round. Like, they just keep doing that. And one of the most important things for them that they didn't have in the Atlantic pirates world was the regularity of ships coming in on this Hajj. And there's only one small little area that you can get in there to go there, and so they would just kind of sit hiding in these little places waiting for these ships to come. And Hajj happens at certain times exactly, so they would know when they were ready. So they would get all of their needs of knowing when and where to be was already known to them. And so it was very easy for them, and this was like a good kind of target and a good place to make a lot of money. And so a lot of those pirates from the Atlantic actually moved over to this Western Indian Ocean. So the most important, not most important, but the most famous, let's say, the most famous like pirate take of all time, the greatest pirate, booty that was ever taken, was this very famous ship called the Ganji Sawai, or the British called it I think the Gunsway or something like that. And this was, again, a merchant ship with pilgrims that were, coming through this, Mandeb Strait, that very small little strip you can see at the top of the screen there. And the pirates would sit and wait. And the pirate that was in charge of this was a man named Henry Avery, very famous. And what's interesting about him is, not only, like I was saying, like there was many people kind of coming out of this, is he basically brought together a bunch of different pirates. And so there was actually 5 ships sitting there waiting to take this thing. He was known as the King of Pirates. And there was a kind of new kind of occupation or world that they were trying to carve out for themselves. Of course, as we'll see in the next example, this does run into problems. So after this happened, this became a problem because now you have British kind of like rebels, you could say, these so-called privateers turned pirates, who are attacking British ships. Mughal ships. And then, of course, the Mughals would be upset, and then they would complain to the British, who were trying to make their, inways in and supplant the Mughals. So they wanted to kind of keep them happy at the same time. They weren't in full control yet. And so the British, even though they had probably sponsored some of this stuff to attack French and Spanish ships, now these pirates were attacking the Mughals, and so the British were getting upset with their own kind of Navy people. So, and this Gunsway ship was Aurangzeb's ship. It was owned by him. So again, a kind of a direct attack on the Mughal crown. So the last one was what's his name? Thomas Kidd. Kidd was also a privateer, and in fact, he was contracted at the time. He took another ship called the Kedeg Merchant. He was contracted by people. He even had a type of, kartaz from the King of England, who, basically, said, please go and, attack these ships and get this wealth and bring it back to us. And when he didn't, the British, in conjunction with the Mughals, interestingly enough, sent out kind of like a manhunt for this famous pirate. They found him. They brought him back home. They used him as the scapegoat. So this is how the British government was playing it. See, they made it look like, oh yes, this person is defected from us, and we're now going to attack him. And so the Mughals were quite happy about this. They felt like the British were at least taking care of this stuff, and they executed him. So it was quite a interesting, moment, you could say, in terms of, again, these shifting alliances, shifting changes, who's on whose side at what point and for what reason. So it was a very interesting, I would say, period, the way I see it, and I keep on using this metaphor of the ocean, but it is like the ocean. It's moving around. It doesn't stay static. It's dynamic at all times. And, history is a dynamic process. Your enemy one day becomes your friend the next. And I think if we look at the kind of complexity of those things, the dynamism of history, then I think we get a little bit more exciting picture of things. So I'll just read this little bit. So from all of this, is a volatile century witnessed the decline of Portuguese maritime supremacy, the ascendancy of British naval power, the transformation of the Siddhis from foe to friend of the Mughals, the rise of the Maratha power by way of increased coastal fortifications, and the transition of English seamen from state-sponsored pirates to reviled pirates. So there is a lot going on at this time. And just to kind of end on a point that I've been thinking about a lot, is the difference between, here's Henry Avery, and here's Aurangzeb again, and Kidd. Oh, sorry, I should mention this. This is an image of the Mughals apparently building ships, although we don't have much, certainly no physical evidence, but don't have much other evidence that shows this. I'd be curious if people know more about that. I'd be interesting to look at. So, well, before I say thank you, I just want to make one last point. And this is really, I think, what this paper and this research makes me think about is, what is the real difference between an empire and a colony, or a colonial power? And I think the two are related to the sea, in the sense that, and a navy, it's almost, at least looking at the history, it almost seems that you have to have a navy, or you have to have sea power at some level in order to have a colony. And without that, you can't really be a colonial power. You could be an empire, but not necessarily a colonial power. And I think, I don't think the Mughals really had those kinds of aspirations to do that. I mean, they certainly didn't exhibit that. I think they were fine and happy enough just staying in India. But I think that lack of thinking as the world was changing, as these European powers gained in power, that lack of thinking about the sea, or at least defending against it, was probably one of the critical factors in the decline of the Mughal Empire and the rise of the colonial powers of Europe. Okay, so I think that's a lot. I talked for a long time, and thank you to all of you for listening. And I'll just stop sharing now, and I would love to hear from all of you and hopefully answer any questions that I can. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It was a very, very informative talk. And now we can take few questions from the participants.
Sure.
So any questions, guys?
Students, you can post some questions. Okay, let me start. Srini, I will start the discussion.
Okay.
So, thank you so much for enlightening us on the last point, empire and colonialism.
Yeah.
So, I just want to have some inputs from the idea of colonialism started I think it started from 1600s, where almost all the European nations were into colonial powers. Prior to that, we don't find the European states like Portugal, Spain, Britain and France. They were venturing into seas right from the late 15th and 16th century. And as you have rightly pointed out, the balance of trade was in favor of India during the time of Mughals. And it was the Europeans who came to India to buy Indian goods. And European goods were not in demand in Indian markets. In that scenario, is there really a lacuna on the part of the Mughals not to focus on the seas, or they just remained as a land-owned empire?
Yeah, I think really, and this maybe the Mughals take up maybe an older Indian thinking, and I'm saying Indian not from even a cultural standpoint, but almost just a geographical standpoint. Matlab, India is so rich with all resources. Like you said, we don't need European goods. That we had all the best textiles, all the gold, all the food, everything was there. So I think it's the richness of the Indian subcontinent that once people kind of arrive there, you're quite happy with what's what's there. So I think for them, at least this is I'm just guessing. I think they didn't have that kind of desire. And here's the other point. I don't think, and this is actually a distinction between the old India and the Mughals. The fact that even in old India, like I'm saying, yes, it's not like we didn't have any naval powers and we didn't build ships. We did. But the Mughals, they were, Central Asian guys. Absolutely they never even saw the ocean until they came to India. So it's like the idea of like going out on boats and ships was just so foreign to their whole cultural background and history that I think those two factors together is what made it happen. So one, they didn't really have any background in it, and they didn't have a history of it at all. They had no knowledge of it. And two, when they got to India, they didn't need to pick up that knowledge because everything was there for them and they were quite happy just doing this. But, like I'm saying, even the Mughals, they did have some ships and they did do some, but it wasn't like a big part of their agenda. it was small. So yeah, I think those are the two things that I'd say.
So in that case, what made the successes, the Marathas to focus on the navy? Is that the presence of the Europeans by then who have become very stronger,
Yeah.
or what made the Marathas to focus on the navy? And since you have worked a lot on Vijayanagara, and especially your book on Raya, you should tell us because the South India had very good contact with the seas.
Yeah.
In time real South India has very good contact with the seas. So is that the north-south mentality which did not make the Mughals to venture into the sea?
Possibly. Possibly. Yeah, I mean, in the South, definitely we have a kind of deeper, closer connection, let us say, to the sea. Again, from geographical point, we just have more coastline that is available to people. Yeah. But going back to the Maratha question, I think, you see, Shivaji represents a more forward-thinking type of, military strategist. You know, he wasn't sitting comfortable with a lot of money. He couldn't be complacent. Like that attack on Surat was strictly to get funds. So he was on the move. He had to strategize. He saw, and he could see this. He could see how the European powers were dominating the Mughals at sea. And so he had that in his mind that, I need to get into this game if I'm going to have any kind of power here at all. And like I said, he actually built, I think, 4 or maybe 5 forts along the coast there that were critical. And then again, like developed this, what's his, Kanoji, the big military Navy guy. And interestingly enough, then, these become Indian pirates, because then the Mughals start thinking that these guys are like pirates. The funny thing is then these Maratha Navy men, they're hiring, who are they hiring? They're hiring Portuguese, British, French, random guys who were, again, remember, some of these the colonial powers were rejecting these people, saying, hey, don't do this kind of stuff, even though they were asking them to do this stuff. And so those guys got frustrated with their own governments, and then started coming over and saying, oh, you find my skills important and useful, yes, I'll sail on this Maratha vessel. Vijayanagara is interesting because Vijayanagara as an empire, as a concept, never really had a maritime consciousness, I would say. Like the Mughals, they outsourced this kind of port city stuff. They let the merchants run that business. And then, of course, they would trade with those merchants. But for the most part, they didn't develop. I mean, I don't know of any Vijayanagara navy at all. And again, Vijayanagara is also inland. It's not on the coast. There's the mountains there really make it tough. The Ghats there, it was a strenuous journey, actually. But I write a lot about this is what the Portuguese did. The key thing that the Portuguese did, at least, so this is like 100 years earlier, early 16th century. They take Goa. And what they do, and this is they're very smart colonial fellows. What they do is they take all of the small port cities that, I was mentioning these merchants are at, that Vijayanagara trades with, and they basically come in and say, hey, you have to stop this, and you have to send all your stuff to Goa. So they basically eliminate that kind of localized port trading, centralize it in Goa, and then by doing that, then they become the boss of everything. And the main thing that the Portuguese were importing at that time, at least for Vijayanagara, were horses. And these horses were coming in from, all this Iran and all that side. And then what they would do is they would go to Vijayanagara and say, we'll sell you a horse for 100 paradao. And okay. And then he would go to Bijapur and he said, we'll sell you this horse for 150 pardao. And he said, okay. And then he'd go back to Vijayanagar and says, hey, that guy's giving me 150. How much are you going to give me? So like that, they would have these bidding wars. And, this is classic colonial strategy, divide and conquer. Split these people up and make them fight each other, and we win. And a lot of that, what I was talking about, that allegiance shifting, moving here, moving there, one person going this way, one person being good in their eyes in 1 minute and then bad in the, that's all of this kind of posturing of power, I think I gave a lot of information. All the students are scared or something.
We have a question, sir.
Okay, great.
Why did the Mughals choose to continue traveling by sea to Hajj when attacks were made rather than using the land? By Aishwarya.
Good question. Probably because well, first of all, it's hard to go overland from India to Mecca. I mean, it's a long and strenuous journey, and also, physically hard, geographically very difficult. And then third, there was probably a lot of political, I'm not sure exactly what was happening in that zone. Let us say, like in Afghanistan. What was Afghanistan like in 17th century? We'd have to look into it. It's probably like it is now, unfortunately. It's a hard place to go. So basically, it's a very difficult journey to make overland. Very difficult. And in those days, it would have taken, months. So the sea was basically the easiest way. And also, I might add, if there were people who were going overland, they were doing that out of their deep religious feeling. But we have to remember that the people that went by ship were usually like fairly well-off people. Remember, this is like the Queen's ship, and so it was reserved for, I would say, some elites, mostly. But I'll have to look into what was going on in that route, the land route, to answer more carefully. But that would be what my guess would be.
Is there any other questions from the students?
Thank you, Aishwarya.
But Srini, I request you to present one more lecture on your Krishna Deva Raya. We'll be very happy to hear from you on your book.
On Raya, sure, yeah, can do that. It was actually really nice to go back. When the book came out, I gave a lot of talks, and it's fun. I enjoyed every time, but I was doing it a lot. And then this paper, I actually had to go back and read my own paper because I kind of forgot some of the things. But it was nice to return to a different period of history. But then, like you're saying, there's also interesting connections that are happening between all of this, and certain themes. Again, like this: what is an empire versus a colony? Like, has India ever been a colonial power? No, I don't. I mean, you could argue that going to Indonesia, that could have been considered, but even then, no. I mean, if I could make a more bold comment, I would say that India did have a type of colonialism, but it was not militaristic. It was a cultural type of colonialism. In this, not in a negative sense, but if you look at all of Southeast Asia, I mean, that India was the high culture for all of those civilizations. I mean, even the kings of Thailand are still Ramas. So there was a power that India exerted culturally at that time. Maybe, of course, not as much now, but we were never a civilization that really went out to dominate, which is interesting in the sense that by not going out, we also became the place where everybody came, for good, bad, or ugly. And then I think the last point, again, these are big generalizations, but they're interesting nonetheless. No matter who came to India, they retained themselves and their elements, but they became Indian. They became Indianized in that certain kind of way that only Indians know, that, you can feel. And so I think when I look at all this stuff, what I really feel is we're still, to me, in a type of post-colonial, or basically still in a colonial type of world. It's just that colonialism now is about global markets and global capitalism. And, we're, unfortunately, I think, and I understand it's important too, but we're running after that a little too much, I think. And if we can try to remember back that older way, that we don't need to actually run away, that we have everything right here. I think we could get a lot of inspiration from that. I think that's actually why it's so important, particularly for us Indians, to study history, is because it's very rich. We don't study it enough. We let other people in the West write our own histories, which is a major problem. Not that they're not great scholars in their own right, but we also need an Indian perspective on these things. And lastly, that history, even though it might be old and ancient, is just as much relevant to our present day predicaments that we're facing. I think is probably, to me, the most important reason why, because I actually think that history, the past, has a lot of answers for our future. That's what I believe. But we just need to start listening more to that and thinking about it.
Thank you, Srini. Yes, Deepika.
Thank you, sir. I call upon Dr. Vichitra to deliver vote of thanks.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. On behalf of the faculty and the students of Department of History, it gives me an immense pleasure to propose vote of thanks on this memorable occasion. And we would like to thank our beloved principal, Dr. Paul Wilson, for encouragement and support to organize this occasion. And our heart fills with a gratitude and respect for our distinguished speaker, Dr. Srinivas Reddy, for not only sparing their invaluable time for us to grace this occasion, but also enlightening us with his commendable lecture on this Mughal Empire in 17th century. Thank you, sir, for enhancing our understanding pertaining to the Mughals with an inspirational thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
No event can take shape without a hardworking leader. And we are grateful to our head of the department, Dr. R. Venkatramanujam, for his guidance, constant support, and encouragement for this occasion. And I would like to thank our organizing secretary, Dr. K. Ashok, for his dedication and enthusiasm, which made this event as a successful one. The vote of thanks would be largely incomplete without expressing our thanks to our students who are the backbone of our department. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you, Srini. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. God bless.